My name is John Chenoweth. I'm the Dean of the College of Business and Economics. So if I haven't met you before, hi. Praveen's passing out some stuff. Praveen Varbatia is a management professor and runs our Business Ethics Week show. So this is the start of Business Ethics Weeks for us. A sort of an important week for us as we get students engaged in talking about issues around business ethics. But I'm mainly here to introduce our guest speaker today, Erik Mahlke. I'll give you a brief overview of his background. Erik is an accounting alum. How many of you are accountants? How many in accounting accountants? Okay. So he was an accounting alum from a few years back, 1979, to give it away, and has led a really interesting career. So he left here. He went to work for Norwest, which is now part of Citibank, or was a part of Citibank.
Wells Fargo.
Wells Fargo. And worked with Wells Fargo, has worked with Citibank, has worked with U.S. Barclays Bank. But interestingly, he has sort of done that all over the world. So he has managed audit processes and been a COO in places like Saudi Arabia, Russia. He's been in the United Kingdom a little bit, I believe, correctly, right? Germany, and in China. He actually hosted a group of myself and a group of students that were in Shanghai about 6 years ago while he was doing a stint overseas there. And so he's got, I think, lots of interesting stories to tell you. If that all doesn't impress you about his career, he also, I learned at lunch today, he was a cosmonaut for a day with, I assume it's the Russian Air Force, actually, or some group in...
Space Ventures from here.
Space Ventures from here, okay.
They tie together with the Russian space program.
Excellent, great. And so got to go on a weightless flight with Jim Cameron, who the director and producer of Avatar and lots of other stuff. And only one of the two got sick, I heard, and it wasn't our alum that got sick on the plane. So anyway, I turn it over to Erik. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Is this one on now? You're okay with this one? Oh, great. Anyway, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that, and I'm glad to be here today. Thank you all for coming. I'm sure you had to do on this gorgeous day. We finally had a summer coming to southern Wisconsin. I'm happy to be here today. As he mentioned, I've had a long career overseas. First, I was in internal audit, enforcing supposedly those ethical considerations, and then later I was in the line function in operations, running operations and technology for Citibank in Russia and China, and then later Barclays in Russia as well. But what I like to try to do, at least just to start, is kind of what about ethics, and how do you go about doing some of that kind of stuff? And the driving influence in the U.S., or from the U.S. perspective, is, which some of you may be aware of, is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or the Fcpa. This has been around since before I graduated from Whitewater, and it's been amended in things 1977. But basically it has two components. The first one is on anti-bribery, and the second is on the accounting aspects. And what that talks about is, on the anti-bribery side, for them to do that, it's any U.S. citizen, business entity, anybody working for a U.S. business entity that tries to bribe a foreign official to get favor or influence. And that's the anti-bribery side. But they have to prove intent in that sense. The other side is the accounting side of it, and what that is you cannot issue your financial statements that are erroneous or misleading. And what that's getting at is, if you are paying those bribes, how are you accounting for them? Of course, the tax guys really love that too, because that could be their income or not a deductible expense from that side of things. So that's kind of the driving influence. But I think from my perspective, what ethics is about is knowing right from wrong. If you know right from wrong and you try to do the correct thing in any instance, that will happen. And it's not just overseas that this happens. This happens here too, I'm sure. I live just outside of Chicago. They've had notorious past down there of what's going on. I've also lived in Las Vegas, which we called it the Wild West when I was out there still, where things happen when you have lots of cash flowing around the places. But what do you need to do to try to meet those types of things? Well, first, your firm should have a policy that you don't allow these types of things to happen. And you want to go through that. And then from there, you train your employees. You talk about it annually. You go through a training program to talk about what the policy means, how this goes. And especially in the parts of the world I was in, I enjoyed what's called emerging markets. Most of them are now kind of emerged markets now. But as they were coming on, people were coming out of systems that they aren't used to the way we do business or the way Western Europe did business. I was definitely in the old communist states, as you can see by my history of being in Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, as well as China. But what I found was people in those parts of the world were very interested in how we do business. How do we go about doing this? Where do we stand? The difference is, though, a lot of times the U.S. tends to try to take what worked here and says it's going to work everywhere. That doesn't always happen, whether it's political type of situation or business situation. It doesn't always work. I think the most interesting thing now that we're seeing is, especially as China has emerged over the last decade as being kind of the manufacturer for the world. They want all this information, and they're taking it and they're building their processes. But they want to do it in a Chinese style, which is very much relationship-based, long-term kind of a scenario as opposed to a quick fix. To do is you want to know who are the third parties you're working with, your vendors, et cetera, and try to get them to understand what your ethics are of your company and how you try to portray this and what you think is right and wrong and how you want them to do business on your behalf. Because at this point, if they're dealing with your customer or helping you with some other entities to do things, whether it's getting your goods out of customs in a country, you want them to be mirroring your type of ethical situation. Because the nice thing about the U.S., and I use that in kind of quotes, is that we believe our laws can be what we call transportable. They can be applied in any country. Well, a lot of countries don't like that. They violate those countries' laws. A good example of that was when I was in audit in Western Europe even. We were doing a review in Spain at the time, and we found that our franchise in Spain had a number of accounts of Cuban nationals. Now, the embargo's been going on for how long? 50 years? It's only now starting to thaw. And it was technically against the law to open accounts in an American bank, even in a foreign land, with a Cuban national, because the way the wording wasn't just about certain officials in Cuba. It was a kind of a blanket statement. Well, there are a lot of Cubans who travel back and forth to Spain because of their historical ties together, and the business was really perplexed. They didn't know what to do at first because, okay, we're violating U.S. law. All right, we got to figure that out. But at the same time, if we do block those accounts and stop funds from going in and out of those accounts, we're violating Spanish law, and we will lose our franchise there. This was a grand debate that went all the way to New York, to our headquarters and our senior legal folks who met with the people at OFAC in the U.S. to try to alleviate this. And what OFAC did, which is a government entity that monitors this, they gave us authority, or they gave us approvals on an individualized basis for all of those accounts and explained how they wanted us to do that in the future so that we could still meet what was going on with the law of the land here, but at the same time not violate the Spanish law. So in this case, when we were in audit and we found that, there was one of your ethical dilemmas. What do you do from a business perspective? You know it's going to hurt the business if we try to do this. It could hurt our impact, our reputation in the local marketplace. But yet, we felt we still need to do this because we are a U.S. institution. Because the one thing when I moved into operations that I always thought of is because I'm a U.S. citizen, I can go to jail under Fcpa. My staff won't because they're locals, and they'll be doing what happens in that local country. So that was kind of a driving influence. Do I want to go to jail? Do I not want to go to jail? And so I always tried to team up with our legal counsel to make sure he was my best friend to keep me out of jail in those kinds of instances when we had to have some of those dilemmas. I think the other thing you need to do is establish internal controls. I don't know if any of you have been to your internal audit class yet from accounting, but you'll have to set up those types of controls over your reporting aspects and the expenses so that things can be caught if they're there. And then the other piece is, there is an exception within Fcpa for what they call facilitating payments. Facilitating payments, they say try not to do too much in facilitating payments because it's a technical exception that they allow within the law. But this is like when we had things tied up in customs and we couldn't get certain things out, whether it was furniture or one of the expats' home goods that they were trying to bring in. Sometimes they were there. And what we would do is there were companies that specialized in getting things through customs. And so generally they were under like a law firm type of thing, and we would hire them for legal advice on that. And then they would try to get those things out of customs. The thing you have to walk a fine line on again is knowing who they are and kind of what are they doing. Because now especially, the Justice Department's even using kind of a broader definition of that and may consider that you need to know exactly what they're doing. Are they paying any bribes to anybody to get those things out or not? And they'll ask those kinds of questions. So it's kind of a fine line you walk. It's not always black and white. That's why I say it gets back to what your moral fabric is. What's important to you? What do you see as right and wrong? And doing it for the right reasons and keeping the appropriate people informed to help you with those decisions within your organization when you're out there. And the last thing, I guess, talking about Fcpa is, if you can, try to get some of that wording in the contracts with your vendors so that they understand this is how we want to do business. We did that a lot at Citibank. We had our vendor policies, we had our other policies ad nauseum, basically, through the organization. But we tried to use those to teach others how to do business the way we want to do business, to try to keep that going. And so that's a little bit on the overview of what kind of drives us. Other countries have also put into place some anti-bribery legislation. The UK has a very strong anti-bribery law that they've now put into place. Even the usual culprits that everybody says, oh, it's really difficult to do business in. Even those countries, Russia, China, Brazil, Mexico, Nigeria, others, all have laws in place talking about this. The question, what happens a lot of times in these countries is they may have a law there because they want the World Trade Organization to accept them, whether it's that or for piracy of DVDs and stuff like that. It's whether the enforcement actions get done or not. That's always the interesting thing to see how it gets enforced. And so those are kind of some of the things that are there. I think the interesting thing is, more so probably when I moved into operations did I have more ethical questions, because now I was running the line piece. I was dealing with our outside customers as well as the vendors, as opposed to when I was in audit. And we tried to take a look at different types of things from that side of things. A lot of it was geared toward getting things in and out of customs. When I was in Russia, and I was also responsible for managing our franchise in Kazakhstan and Ukraine. They had similar laws. They had what they called currency control rules, because their currency does not float on the open market. They set the rates against a dollar or a euro from that side of things. And they wanted to know where was the money going. And I had a great conversation one day with the deputy chairman of the central bank in Kazakhstan when I was there. And she was the first one of the three countries that was finally able to explain, why do we still have currency controls there? And she said, really, because, and why do you make the bank the police in this regard for you? And she said, well, because the banking system is the only place we trust the information that's coming from the different companies, because all the money has to flow through it somehow to get out to another location. And what they did was they made it very onerous for the people of companies and stuff to fill out paperwork, get it all filled out properly. And that made it tough for a lot of banks. A lot of our customers say, well, you guys are too tough. But they always said, if we have a difficult situation, we're going to come to you, not one of your competitors, because we know you're going to do it right. And so we felt pretty pleased about that kind of a situation. And so that's a little examples, I guess, of how you have to try to look at things and do that type of thing. Russia, everybody asked me, how did you deal with the Mafia there? Well, as I was telling some people, you either pay the good guys or you pay the bad guys, so to speak. They usually left us alone as Citibank because they knew we were a global institution. They knew we had very strict standards that we applied. And I also think the government had something to do with that as well, because they wanted us there to help promote the economy and their view in the world. And so they, I think, also may have put pressure on that. Plus, there were plenty of other smaller businesses that these guys could take advantage of, let's say. A good example of that was one of our prime customers, who's a multinational in the cigarette business, was there, and they tried to, besides just importing the cigarettes and distributing them, they tried to get into the local distribution channels that were well entrenched with some of these other parties. Well, what ended up happening was one day, I think it was in St. Petersburg, one of their distribution centers had a little problem, something blew up. And so then they realized they needed to get out of that business, stay in their piece that they were good for, that they weren't going to be bothered by these other guys. And that's part of, I think, too, as you go into some of these countries, you need to do a risk assessment and see what are going to be the risks for my business in this country to do business here. How do I go about it? And if the risks are such that they're too great, then you say, maybe I don't want to get into that aspect, or I'm only going to go in this little niche area where it isn't quite as risky from that side of things. So that's another way to look at it from that side of things. So at this point, I think I've done enough talking. I love to tell you some more war stories as we go through, but I want to hear kind of what are you guys interested in? What are you seeing, hearing, talking about from an ethical side of things? If there are any questions, or any questions about certain parts of the world, I can try to help you with that as well. Yes?
What did you think about the whole scandal with the organization?
Yeah, it's probably one of the most corrupt organizations around, I think. I've never been a fan of Sepp Blatter when I sat and listened to him talk when I was overseas, because you could tell what was happening, especially this last time when a place like Qatar, no disservice to Qatar, but why they were granted the World Cup in a period of the year where you would not even want to be close to Qatar because the temperatures are going to be so hot. And to do an athletic event outside is going to be extremely difficult. I think they're going to have a very difficult time, whoever replaces him, getting into the organization and changing the culture, but that's where it's got to start. In any organization, the tone is set at the top. If the senior person on site or the senior person in the region is not behind you to try to push that we want to do this in what we see as our values for our company or our business, or that they aren't behind you in the types of internal controls you want to set up, it fails. But if they are behind us, then you can really succeed and make a lot of progress very quickly, even when it doesn't look so good. A good example of that was when I was in Russia. I went in post-1998 crisis in Russia. I was in there in October. In August of that year, Russia became the first country to default on their own currency. because most governments just keep printing more currency and it causes inflation, but they pay their debts. Russia said no more. And our bank, as well as many others, were in that mode of, well, we'll just pump money in and invest in Russian government bonds at 120%. We don't care, it's going to be great. Governments don't fail, do they? No, unless they're taken over by another country in a war or something. But they don't fail, so it's got to be safe. All of a sudden, billions of dollars later, a lot of banks lost a lot of money in that case. And in our situation, there were a lot of the foreign banks were fleeing Russia. They wanted to get out as quickly as possible because they were losing so much money there. We also had a lot of other multinational clients there. They were all coming back to us. We may have had a small piece of their business. Now all of a sudden we had huge amounts. And our business couldn't handle it. Our volume spiked so high and we were losing money as well. Not so much from the local franchise, but because we were investing from London at that point in the bonds. Similar to your investment group over here. They're not investing in that stuff, but from afar. And they couldn't handle it. And there were some seniors in Citibank that were talking about closing the franchise as well. And that was when a couple months later they asked me to go out to Russia, try to settle it down somehow, get through it. I was on a 6-month assignment in Russia that lasted 7 years. After 2 months, the current head of the business said, you're doing okay, you can stay. 5 years later, the person who I knew was coming to replace me, she had been in Hungary. She had gone back to the US in her new job and was out in Russia, and we met for lunch with her team now, which was one of our product folks. And when I came late to the restaurant, she yelled across the restaurant, "Mahlke, you stole my job." I said, "Hornsby, it's been 5 years, get over it." But it was funny and then everybody in the table was sitting there like, oh my God, they're gonna come to a fight. And then we hugged and kissed and everybody realized we knew each other because I used to audit her as well. But it turned out very well for her because she got a much more senior job and a different part of the company at that point. But that was kind of the fun types of things to take a look at from that side. What else? Feel free. Yes? I think you see the same things just about everywhere. The interesting tact is the immigration laws now that they're talking about here. We see that in many other countries. The interesting thing is, though, a lot of the, I guess, undocumented, quote unquote, illegal aliens, they're coming in and doing jobs local people tend not to want to do. They're there and they say they're taking my job, but they're not really taking their job because those people don't want to go out in the fields and pick peaches, cotton, and those types of things. The same thing happens in some other countries. They love to bring in a lot of, Saudi Arabia is one now that's having a tremendous problem because their native population has grown immensely. But they don't have any jobs for these people because historically Saudi Arabia has brought in millions of expatriates to come in and do every job you could think of for them. When I was there in '93, I was post first Gulf War, everybody that we had, so many in the bank, there was a concerted effort by the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia to what they called Saudicize the banks. And that was we had to have a certain percentage of local Saudis in jobs in the bank. And so that was part of my job, was to try to localize my audit team. I had a team of 10 at that point. When I first got there, I only had 2 Saudis out of the 10 of us. When I left, we had grown the team to, I think, 13, and we had 10 Saudis on that team to try to promote job growth for the locals. And it wasn't because they weren't qualified, because most of them have been sent over here or in Western Europe to university institutions. We were talking at lunch that there were a huge number of Saudis here a few years back that went through a program that was a scholarship program that was here at Whitewater. And so you try to build that up and move that forward. I think the thing, as I mentioned earlier about China wants to learn. And I think in all these countries, at least I've been very lucky to work with the people I've worked with, because they were all very interested in learning and doing better for themselves and trying to help their families get better. And so they really wanted to learn, but at the same time, they wanted to make sure they did it in kind of their definition of what is ethical and what is their culture, which I can respect. I don't necessarily agree with everybody's culture that I've been in, but I have to at least respect it, because I'm a visitor in those situations. And that's how kind of I looked at things. It was a great opportunity to go overseas and do that. And if any of you have that chance, whether it's from a study group here, in fact, the first time I went overseas was from here. I was in the Soviet Studies course with Dr. Underwood, as I was telling them, from the geography department back in the 70s. And we went to the old Soviet Union and from there, because it's a great learning experience. But at the same token, people overseas don't understand why Americans have such a myopic view of everything else, that it's their way. And like I explained, when I was in Russia, that's where I met my wife. She's from Moscow. And when we had our wedding, they were trying to understand this. They couldn't understand that my sister, who was almost retiring at that point, not quite yet, but she was in her 50s at that time, got her first passport to come to my wedding in Russia. She had never left pretty much the Midwest at that point. But that's the difference in how we've grown up here versus how things have happened in Europe. Because Europe is basically the size of the US, but multiple countries. And to move across lines, you got to have a passport. And in Russia, it was even more difficult until they opened up in 96, I think, when Glasnost started. Russians have 2 sets of passports. They have an internal passport that you have to carry with you all the time to show who you are. It's kind of like a national ID program, but they call it a passport. And then they have their international passport. Not everybody has an international passport. That was, you had to apply and go through the pieces, because they were so afraid everybody was leaving or doing some other things in the old days. Now they can all get passports. But it's a very different style. Moscow is one of the most expensive places in the world, or it was. I think it's been supplanted now by a couple others the last few years. But it was a very expensive city. But yet, I'm just amazed at how resilient the people are there. They're very lovely folks. You get down and get past the government things. That's the other thing I think travel helps open things up. You start to dialogue with people and you find out they're just like you. They have the same concerns, maybe on a little different tact, but they have the same concerns, the same things they want to do with their life or make better for their families, whether it's there or in China or India, Saudi Arabia, any of those countries. And my motto is always treat people with respect and try to learn about that. But some of the stories my wife will tell, you just are heart-wrenching what she went through in Soviet times. And even when we were there in the late 90s, early 2000s. For example, her grandmother was retired. She had a pension. Her pension basically at that point translated to $70 US. That had to pay for her apartment. It had to pay for food. And there wasn't a whole lot left. And so I don't really know And the pensions haven't grown that much in the last decade there for the older folks. And if it wasn't for their families trying to take care of their other parts of the family, I think it would be extremely difficult for them. And it's not just Russia that's doing that. That happens many places. I think that's the neat thing in some of the other countries that I've been in, is it's still much more closer family ties, which is kind of a nice thing, in that the older folks are helping take care of the younger folks, but then the middle folks help take care of the older folks as well, which is a very neat thing to see and do. Other questions?
So I know you mentioned like China, how they're trying to learn stuff. I've also read up a lot on how the government is kind of allowing some people to like hack the United States for intellectual property. So what do you think about that?
Well, I wouldn't call it ethical under my definition of doing that. That is happening. In fact, one of my friends now was just telling us this weekend when he was in China. He worked 2 places, one in Shanghai for one company, and then for Motorola in Beijing. And the company, I can't remember the name of the company, it was a smaller company in Shanghai, but they had gotten hacked, not just externally, but also internally in what we would call industrial espionage of some of their staff stealing their proprietary information and giving it away. And he had a very bad experience working there, and he was glad that he was able to have the other experience that he had with Motorola. That's happening all the time. I'm sure it happened to us as well. But at least I hope we made it so difficult that they didn't get what they really wanted to get from that. And it's getting more difficult because there is more state-sponsored espionage like that, of trying to steal secrets or at least slow down different companies by sending viruses, worms, et cetera, out through the system to try to do that. And it's going to be very difficult because, as I say, not everybody has the same background. A lot of it, politics comes into play. Right now, I've seen the early days when we used to do the drills where you used to go down in the hallway in your schoolroom and put your head between your legs because of a nuclear attack back in the 60s and that. And then I was there when Glasnost happened and after Glasnost, and how we became very good friends with our former enemies in the ex-Soviet Union. And now, because of things that have happened in the last year, they've gotten much more strained again because of the relationship of Russia and their near neighbors and things that they want to have more influence over instead of having the West have the influence. And so that's gotten much more tense again and difficult. And now I was just reading yesterday that our tensions with Saudi Arabia are getting at a peak again, which has always kind of been there as well. But apparently there's a law before Congress that Congress wants to allow survivors of people who died at 9/11 to be able to sue the Saudi government for that because bin Laden was a Saudi. Well, back in the days, Saudi had taken away bin Laden's passport and said you were no more, and he was kind of an outcast from the bin Laden family. It was a very big family. In fact, they were on our board at the bank that I worked at in Saudi Arabia. They were a big concrete and construction manufacturer and stuff, and they had disowned him as well. So it's very difficult. It's not a good thing. That's why you really got to have some good controls in place and really testing your systems, and especially like intrusion type testing. Not everybody can do that. You got to hire some experts on that kind of situation. We did that when I was at Barclays in Russia because they were just new coming back into Russia. And they wanted to make sure this bank they had bought had stronger controls over their technology, so they would know. You might not be able to stop it completely, but what you want to do is once they get in, you don't want them to be able to go around in your systems to find things. And so you want to be able to stop them, or at least corral them into a certain location. And that's about the only thing you can really do right now. It's a good question though, because that's really a hot topic right now, is data security. Data privacy is another big piece that's out there. You see it not only from the bank side of things, but you see it from healthcare, especially with the HIPAA laws in place and guarding your medical records. I'm finding now, what I'm reading on data privacy, I guess I'm getting away from ethics, but it is ethical because it's about stealing information, is more people are starting to attack and hack healthcare databases than they are trying to go after the banks or some other types of industries, because there's such a wealth of information. They don't really care whether you had an appendectomy and those kind of things, but what they do is get other information about you personally that then they can use to try to translate into either your identity or trying to do some financial type things as well. Yes? Well, I think a key thing is, it really takes desire. It's not so much smarts. I would say today I graduated an accounting major. I've never worked as an accountant, yet I know a lot of accounting. I worked in audit on the internal side. I worked in operations. In Citibank, in fact, the way they set it up is since I was the senior country operations officer, we had a CFO who did the bookkeeping and stuff, but I had to, or the record keeping, but I was responsible for all the book entries and those types of things and the controls over the process from my side of things. But the key thing is desire, I think. And, having the challenge to take new challenges, to try something new. I look back on my career and I remember lots of things, even back to my first jobs. And I remember one of my first Citibank bosses asked me, he said, "How come you talk about all these good things you had when you were at Norwest?" I said, "Because they were. I had a good time there. I learned a lot." Because he didn't remember anything where he worked before. He came through public accounting, but he didn't remember any of those kinds of times. But I was very beneficial in the sense that our chief auditor at the time was very active in the Institute of Internal Auditors. He brought in a lot of bright people and he allowed them to succeed. What does that mean? It means it also allows them to fail. And you don't always find managers like that who allow you to take some chances to try to do something different than what you've done. And so I learned a lot in that kind of format, because I remember a lot of the times everybody's great myth number one is the auditor comes in and says, "I'm here to help you." They always tell the line manager, "Yeah, right, get out of here." And one of the things I learned early on was listening. Listening is probably the most important skill you can have. And what I mean by listening doesn't just mean sit back and listen. It means you're an active listener. As you hear things, you start to question things or ask other questions depending on where the conversation goes. But that's very important in how you learn about the business. And I think that's why I was successful as an internal auditor, was because when I talked to the people in the line, I talked to them about other things than just their controls or their policies. Because I learned early on from that first job that I had was, you can get from point A to point Z in a straight line and the policy says you have to do this. Kind of boring after a while. You lack creativity. How do you try to come up with something different if it doesn't fit the policies. Well, what I learned was, well, you have fence posts on each side, and you can get from A to Z. And from my side as an auditor, I want them to do it within their risk component and how they look at it with their controls. But they could do different types of controls and maybe zigzag their way down to the bottom to get there. And that's okay, as long as you stay within the fence boundaries. If you get outside the boundaries, then I'm going to have a chat with you as the audit head and tell you we need to do these things. A great example of that was when I first went to Saudi Arabia. Our first audit was an audit of their treasury function. It was a fairly basic function. I had never done treasury before. I came out of commercial banking, small community banks. They don't sit and trade this, that, and the other thing. And then I was in U.S. bank cards for Citi, and that was credit cards. We didn't do a whole lot of that either. So I didn't know much. We brought in some experts. My team was there already. A couple of them understood that. But when I came in to replace my predecessor, they also had replaced the treasurer. Now this, to me, was a problem that Citi had, because the previous guy that was running the Treasury Department was more of a trader. He did a lot of the deals himself. He didn't train his staff real well. So when he left, the knowledge left with him as to what his positions were and some of those types of things. The new guy that came in was more of an administrative type of manager. He could do a little trading, but he was really more bigger picture type of guy. So what happened? The control structure blew up completely. My guys, like the previous guy, they wanted to make it personal. I said, no, it's not personal. Both managers can succeed. What we need to do is figure out what happened and why. And this audit went on for quite some time. But what we did was we tried to focus on what were the main issues and keep people informed. So not only did we let the local manager know what was happening as we went through the review, I let the managing director or the president of the bank know. I also let the regional guys know before we ever issued the report. But before I let the more senior guys know, I always let that primary guy be the one to tell them first. That's how you win friends and influence people. If I went right over him right away, he would never work with me again as a partner in that kind of a situation. This way, he can raise up and say, look, we've got these issues. This is what they're working on. So everybody was aware. We came to the closing meeting. We had 4 major issues in the front of the report. We had 8 total issues, or 8 or 10, attached to the back of the report that we rolled up into these bigger issues. We had people from the regional office. We had people from New York fly in for this review. That's how big a deal it was, because they failed. The meeting lasted an hour and a half. The only reason it lasted an hour and a half was because the local president was delayed in another meeting, and after about 45 minutes he came in, wanted to understand it, so we had to rehash some of it. When we got over that meeting, the head of operations said, this was our first failed review. This was the shortest exit meeting we've ever had, because your predecessors wanted to talk about, well, you didn't sign 4 out of 20 tickets by this manager, and you didn't sign these little things, because they understood when I came to the table, I was only going to talk about the big things. That's what you need to focus on the risk in your business. And that's how what turned out to be later on, when audit wanted to move me back to the US, one of those guys who was in that original meeting, had the first exposure to me, was impressed. He was one of the guys that called me and said, come and work for us on the line side. Another one like that was our Eastern European director, or division head. He used to invite me as his auditor to his meetings with his presidents of the different franchises. They were shocked when they walked in the room and saw me. He was later the president of the Russian franchise when we had an expanded view. And this is where I get at from the top that we talked about earlier, the message from the top. He always said, I'm willing to take all the risk in the world to make money for this company. But if you can't control it, if you can't service it, we're not going to do it. Because what will happen is you'll have that customer in here today, but if Erik in the back office can't process it the way you've sold it, we're going to lose that customer tomorrow. And then where are we? Our reputation in the market will be worse and some of those things. So it really then gets to be a partnership between front and back. And that was where one of the other good things I learned when I moved over on that side and listening to him as well, was how do you work in partnership with people? And over time, in Citibank, I said I don't know if you've gotten to that concept in any of your management courses, it's called matrix management. It's like, I used to be here and I'd have maybe 12 different other managers I had to deal with. Maybe only 1 or 2 were my ones who did my appraisal and did my bonus, but I had to deal with all the other 10 for various parts of the function. I said we were on steroids. It was so bad with that at times. But you had to go as partners, and certain others that you didn't want, they controlled your budget. So you had to have those people involved to discuss of why you want to do something, to bring it together so that you could go to the region and say, yep, we're in agreement here. This is what we want to do to help our customer. And that's the same thing from an ethical side as well, is what's the right thing to do for our customer? That was one of the things I tried to teach a lot of our local folks, not just in my departments in operations, but in my conversations with our marketing folks in the front end and our lenders on the front end when they were out talking to customers. How do we do this together and do what's right for them, but also right for us? And we talked about those types of different trade-offs, risk-reward types of trade-offs that you have to do some days. And some days the answer is, I'm sorry, we can't do it. And they'd always throw up, why? I said, well, because we're a U.S. company. Like it or not, yes, we're a U.S. company in Russia, or we're a U.S. company in Czech Republic. But we still have to do that, or we lose our overall franchise of the whole firm. And we don't want to do that from that side of things. Other questions? Yes?
You talked about culture and how that affects ethics. What has been like the most challenging one that you've had to deal with?
That's a good question. There are lots of differences with everyone. And some more than others. It's hard to just say one's worse than the other. It's like when people ask me, what countries didn't you like, or what country? I always liked them all because I tried to learn a little bit about the culture. I think the difficulty is some that have very, very strong cultures of certain ways of doing business. Saudi is one of those. The Middle East as a whole, let's say. The thing you have to remember, and this is the thing we seem to not understand here. That's my opinion. Not the banks, not anybody else. My opinion. We can make democracies by overthrowing dictators. No, I love dictators in many respects. Not for the people who have to live under them, but from a business side of point, there's a sense of stability. There's a sense of those types of things. And what happens when you have the dictator? Okay, in the Middle East, we threw out Saddam. Going back to Nebuchadnezzar's time in the Bible, he said that area of the world between the Euphrates and what's the other? Sorry, I forgot. Euphrates and what's the other river? Tigris, thank you. Can only be ruled by an iron fist. That was thousands of years ago. It's still the same today. Why? I always wondered, when I grew up, was a lot of the Arab-Israeli conflicts. Still are. There's another one thousands of years old. And the question was, how did this all happen? Israel's sitting here and they're still pretty safe and everybody around them keeps fighting each other instead of their common enemy. Well, the reason is that, in the Middle East especially, it's a very tribal situation. And it's me, my family, my tribe, is how people look at it from a cultural perspective. Country is what the Brits did when they drew the boundaries in that part of the world when the British Empire moved away. So what did you have? And the only reason, if you want to read about it, it's fun. It was a book I was told to read before I went to Saudi Arabia. It was called The Kingdom. Saudi Arabia was the House of Saud, which are the Sunni Muslims. And they paid the Wahhabis to do all the fighting for them. The Wahhabis are this very strict religious guys there. And the Saud tribe took over the peninsula. You had the Rashid family, which then left, and the Rashids, I think, were Iraq, if I remember right. They got pushed out. They became Iraq, basically. And then you had the Hashemites, who were the traders and such. They were in Jeddah. They became the Kingdom of Jordan. That's where that tribe went. So you have all of this kind of going on, what's happening there, and it's very difficult. And we walked in and said, well, we can do this, and we never really had a plan of how do we get out of it. That's why I think even though a lot of people criticized Bush 1 for backing away after they got Kuwait freed, it was probably the right thing to do, because when we went in for the second one, we still don't have an exit strategy of how to deal with all these confrontation of all these different tribes. There's still all that infighting going on. And it's difficult. The Russians learned that in Afghanistan years ago, and now we're still there too, although we're getting more out of it, but it's still the same problem. That part of the world is very difficult. We don't understand it that well, and we don't understand the culture well enough to, how do we play that? And then there are other parts of the world similar to that. You've got the issue in the subcontinent. You got India is 1 billion people on each side. You got Pakistan on the other. And again, this was another artificial divide, pretty much when Britain left. Maybe not totally artificial, but pretty much. Yes, no, from what you guys understand too. Yeah, and it's difficult. And then you've got the Muslim side and the Hindu side. And again, that gets into the religion. More wars have been fought over religion for probably the wrong reasons than what the religion is. The religion isn't essentially bad. None of them are. But what happens is you get extremists on both sides that then start saying our way is the only way, and that's what drives all this other conflict at times. And so you have to kind of try to understand a little bit, so you understand how is my background, how is my culture, how is my morals going to fit into that type of an organization. It was amazing when as I said, I met my wife in Russia, and when we started talking about how she grew up, how I grew up. Okay, I grew up in a Protestant home, and you had church, and you did all these things, and you understood what that was. I started talking to her. She had some of the very same moral standards that I had. But the way it was presented there, because it was an atheist state, it was the Communist Party that took that role. And what happened was it was very taboo to get divorced and those types of things. If you got divorced, you got thrown out of the party. You get thrown out of the party, you don't get anything. You don't get the good jobs. You don't get good flats, the apartments, and those types of things. But since it opened up, unfortunately, to my mind, all the really difficult things about capitalism and freedom and laissez-faire all convoluted into Russia at one time. And Russia's another one that historically has always been ruled by a strong individual, whether it was the Tsar or king, in this case a Tsar, and then you had the Lenin and Stalin and the crowd that ran the Communist Party. Always a strong leader. And so when they finally went to democracy, there's a big void because you don't have enough people who understand it. They like the freedom, don't get me wrong. They want that freedom. But then it's like, but how do I apply that? And that's why I say a lot of times our version of how America grew up is a lot different than most people have ever been. And so that's why it works here but may not work other places. And I'll tell you, after this election, I don't know if it's working here anymore either with the way they're going. But they say some of the previous elections hundreds of years ago were just as bad, the way people were talking about each other. So anyway, that's a little bit on the cultural aspect. It's better to try to learn a little bit
what they're going. You may never be an expert. I still have some, I consider good friends over in Saudi Arabia that I email back and forth. But when I was there, I could never get past a certain part of their life. Like, I never got to meet their family. It's a strange place. I said it was a lot like Vegas. There were blinky lights and there were deserts when I moved there from Vegas. But a lot of other things weren't quite that way. You know, you've got the women fully clothed in black. They used to, one of the jokes was, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be sexist, but they used to say you could tell she was a 10 by her ankle, because that's about all you could see. The strangest things was when you got on a plane to go back to Europe, all these people were on this plane, whether they're in black or the husbands are in their white thobes and their and the gutra, which is like the tablecloth color, the red and white scarf type thing over their heads. And then when you get to London, all these people are getting off. He said, who are these people? I didn't see any of them get on the plane, because it all comes off. This is where it comes back to some cultural thing. Not everybody does it, but a great deal of them do. As soon as you get out of Saudi airspace, the Jack Daniels is flowing, the beer is flowing. It's taboo in their religion. They're not supposed to do that, but now they're out and they can do some things. I had a fantastic Saudi who worked for me. He had gone to school in Tennessee somewhere and loved it. He wanted to get back. But Medhat was wonderful, other than he smoked like a stack. But he would, when we get out of the Saudi, he would drink and he would eat pork ribs, which is another taboo meat in that kind of a situation. I was like, hey, what are you doing here? From some of that. But I think by trying to at least learn and give them the respect that's there, you may not agree with it, but at least to respect the situation, I think helps in developing the relationship so you can deal with others. And that's where I say dealing one-on-one with people is much, much easier than governments dealing with each other. Because the governments always are trying to do something else. Other things? Yes? It depends on what you mean by extreme. There are some extreme components there. I never got to Iran, although my middle sister, she worked in Iran a long time ago for about 5-6 years before the Shah got deposed, so she knows a little about that. The other interesting thing, you know, when we talked about tribes and stuff, the thing you have to remember about Iran, Iran is not Arab. While they are Muslim, and they are more the Shiite part of Islam, they are Persian, historically. Going back to, was it Alexander? Was he Persian? I think. So there's a big, I think the big push between each other, I think it's more the Saudis and the Iranians trying to gain influence over the rest of the other pieces. The other thing is, unfortunately, just like here, there's other parts of the world you have to get ready for different types of racism or nationalism that you run into in some of these places. And it's very difficult for someone like me to understand that. I grew up in La Crosse, Wisconsin. I think we had one minority person in my high school. I mean, I've dealt with lots of minorities ever since, but growing up, it's difficult to understand that. But I think that's part of your growth and in moving in, as we talked about on cultures, it's the same thing here. You know, trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. You may never understand it fully, but at least to give it some flexibility and try to have an understanding so you can have a good conversation about things. And so that's difficult. I know the Saudis saw themselves as the superior Arab. They were up here. The poor Palestinian people who don't have a homeland were somewhere down here. Even though they're brothers, they didn't see them as an equal brother necessarily. And then there were different groups in between. But the thing I find, when I said earlier about it's fun to see good dictators, we did it when I was in Saudi. We went on a tour in Syria, and that was when al-Assad, the senior, was still in charge. We joked that it was smiling al-Assad because they had all these pictures of him smiling everywhere he went in the country, from there like a used car salesman or something. But we found there that there were Muslims, Christians, and Jews all living together. Now, they were very poor, and I'm sure they were pushed down, but there wasn't the conflict that you saw in the broader region necessarily. So they found some way of coming together to work that way. I don't give Assad that credit necessarily, but the people themselves doing that and trying to work together and for the common good of their families. Because at the end of the day, that's where it really comes in a lot of those parts of the world, is people trying to survive. The other sad statement, but I think it's a relatively true one, sometimes it's where you've been born gives you lots of opportunities. I learned that from being here, from a small town in Wisconsin to seeing many places around the globe. And you see some of these other places, some people and how they're living, it's very difficult for those folks. I mean, last year, first time I got a chance to go to Dominican Republic. It's a very poor country. We got to get out into the countryside, out of the cities, and it really kind of tugs at your heartstrings to see how some of these people, what they have to do to survive day in and day out. But some of them make it and they get to the city and they do a good life for themselves. Same thing happens with places I've been in India and Pakistan, and a lot of those people leave the country because they can get good jobs overseas. From our wage standard, it may not be a lot of money, but those folks are able to send a good chunk of their salary back home to help their family get better and live better at home. That's the other thing that has come up over time about businesses and how you're using this cheap Chinese labor or the cheap Vietnamese labor, because now it's moving from China to Vietnam more because it's cheaper to process. Yes, it is cheap, and we as a company should make sure the conditions are better than they've been for those people that work for us when we do that job. But at the same time, I kind of disagree with some of the protests here about you're only paying them little tiddly bits of money. To them, that goes a long way to improving their lifestyle, if it's done the right way. I'm not saying there aren't abuses, okay? I'm not saying that at all, because I know there are abuses out there, and there shouldn't be. But that's where we come from, that ethical question of, if you're working for a company and you see that, you need to raise it to your managers and say, is there some way we can change that? But I think that's another thing that, things are getting better in some of those countries by doing that. And if they didn't have that and we brought it all home, what are you doing? You're leaving a big void there because they're not doing some of that. And a lot of those jobs that have left, again, are ones that people here think are below them sometimes, and they don't want to do them.